Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant, Part 1, continued, Cassette 10, Side 1. Chapter 13, The Conquest of the Sea, 1492 to 1517. 1. Columbus. It was manifest destiny that someone in this age would dare the perils of the Atlantic to find India or Cathay. For 2,000 years legend had told of an Atlantis across the sea, and later myths had placed beyond the Atlantic a fountain whose waters conferred eternal youth. The failure of the Crusades compelled the discovery of America, the domination of the eastern Mediterranean by the Turks, the closing or obstruction of land routes by the Ottomans at Constantinople, and by anti-Christian dynasties in Persia and Turkestan, made the old avenues of east-west trade costly and dangerous. Italy and even France might cling to the remnants of that trade over every discouragement of tolls and war, but Portugal and Spain were too far west to make such arrangements profitable. Their problem was to find another route. Portugal found one around Africa. Nothing was left for Spain but to try a passage west. The growth of knowledge had long since established the sphericity of the earth. The very errors of science encouraged audacity by underestimating the width of the Atlantic and picturing Asia as lying ready for conquest and exploitation on the farther side. Scandinavian mariners had reached Labrador in 986 and 1000 and had brought back news of an immense continent. In 1477, if we may believe his own account, Christopher Columbus visited Iceland and presumably heard proud traditions of Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland. All that was needed now for the great adventure was money. Bravery abounded. Columbus himself, in the maiorazzo, or will that he made before setting out on his third voyage across the Atlantic, named Genoa as his birthplace. It is true that in his extant writings he always calls himself by the Spanish name Cristobal Colon, never by the Italian name Cristoforo Colombo, but this was presumably because he was writing in Spanish, living in Spain, or sailing for a Spanish sovereign, not because he had been born in Spain. Possibly his forebears had been Spanish Christianized Jews who had migrated to Italy. The evidence of Hebraic blood and sentiment in Columbus is almost convincing. His father was a weaver, and Cristoforo appears to have followed that craft for a time in Genoa and Savona. The biography written by his son Ferdinand credits him with studying astronomy, geometry, and cosmography at the University of Pavia, but the university records do not list him, and he himself tells us that he became a sailor at 14. For in Genoa, every road leads down to the sea. In 1476, a ship on which he was heading for Lisbon was attacked by pirates. The vessel foundered. Columbus relates that with the support of some wreckage he swam 6 miles to the shore. But the great admiral had high powers of imagination. A few months later, he says, he sailed for England as seaman or captain, thence to Iceland, thence to Lisbon. There he married and settled down as a maker of maps and charts. His father-in-law was a mariner who had served Prince Henry the Navigator. Doubtless Columbus heard from him some glowing tales of the Guinea coast. In 1482, probably as an officer, he joined a Portuguese fleet that sailed that coast to Elmina. He read with interest and many annotations Pope Pius II's Historia Rerum Gestarum, which suggested the circumnavigability of Africa. But his studies more and more inclined him to the west. He knew that Strabo, in the 1st century of our era, had told of an attempt to circle the globe. He was familiar with Seneca's lines, "An age will come in after years when ocean will loose the bonds of things, and an immense land will appear, and the prophet Typhus will reveal new worlds, and Thule, possibly Iceland, will no longer be the end of the earth." He had read the book of Ser Marco Polo, which glorified the riches of China and placed Japan 1,500 miles east of the mainland of Asia. He made over 1,000 notes in his copy of Pierre Dailly's Imago Mundi. He accepted the prevailing estimate of the Earth's circumference as 18,000 to 20,000 miles, and combining this with Polo's displacement of Japan, he reckoned that the nearest Asiatic islands would be some 5,000 miles west of Lisbon. He had heard of a letter, in 1474, in which the Florentine physician Paolo Toscanelli had advised King Afonso V of Portugal that a shorter way to India than that around Africa could be found by sailing 5,000 miles west. Columbus wrote to Toscanelli and received an encouraging reply. His purpose matured and seethed in his brain. About 1484, he proposed to John II of Portugal that the king should equip 3 vessels for a year of exploration across the Atlantic and back, that Columbus should be appointed Great Admiral of the Ocean and perpetual governor of whatever lands he might discover, and that he should receive 1/10 of all revenues and precious metals thereafter derived from those lands by Portugal. Obviously, the idea of spreading Christianity was secondary to material considerations. The king submitted the proposal to a committee of savants. They rejected it on the ground that Columbus's estimate of the distance across the Atlantic as merely 2,400 miles was far too small. It was approximately correct from the Canary Islands to the West Indies. In 1485, 2 Portuguese navigators proposed a similar project to King John, but agreed to finance it themselves. John gave them at least his blessing. They sailed in 1487, followed too northern a route, encountered rough westerly winds, and turned back in despair. Columbus renewed his appeal in 1488. The king invited him to an audience. Columbus came just in time to witness the triumphant return of Bartolomeu Dias from a successful rounding of Africa. Absorbed in prospects of an African route to India, the Portuguese government abandoned consideration of a passage across the Atlantic. Columbus turned to Genoa and Venice, but they too gave him no encouragement, for they had a vested interest in the eastward route to the east. He commissioned his brother to sound out Henry VII of England, who invited Columbus to a conference. When the invitation reached him, he had already committed himself to Spain. He was now, in 1488, some 42 years old, tall and thin, with long face, ruddy complexion, eagle nose, blue eyes, freckles, bright red hair already turning gray and soon to be white. His son and his friends described him as modest, grave, affable, discreet, temperate in eating and drinking, fervently pious. Others alleged that he was vain, that he paraded and inflated the titles he received, that he ennobled his ancestry in his imagination and his writings, and that he bargained avidly for his share in the New World's gold. However, he was worth more than he asked. He deviated occasionally from the 10 Commandments, for at Córdoba, after his wife's death, Beatriz Enriquez bore him an illegitimate son in 1488. Columbus did not marry her, but he provided well for her in his life and his will. And, as most dignitaries in those agile times had such byproducts, no one seems to have been put out by the accident. Meanwhile, he had laid his petition before Isabella of Castile, this on May 1st, 1486. She referred it to a group of advisers presided over by the saintly Archbishop Talavera. After long delay, they reported the plan to be impracticable, arguing that Asia must be much farther west than Columbus supposed. Nevertheless, Ferdinand and Isabella gave him an annuity of 12,000 maravedis, or about $840, and in 1489 they furnished him with a letter ordering all Spanish municipalities to provide him with food and lodging. Perhaps they wished to keep an option on his project, lest by some chance it should bestow a continent on a rival king. But when the Talavera Committee, after reconsidering the scheme, again rejected it, Columbus resolved to submit it to Charles VIII of France. Fray Juan Pérez, head of the monastery of La Rabida, dissuaded him by arranging another audience with Isabella. She sent him 20,000 maravedis to finance his trip to her headquarters at the siege city of Santa Fe. He went, she heard his plea kindly enough, but her advisers once more discountenanced the idea. He resumed his preparations for going to France in January of 1492. At this critical juncture, a baptized Jew prodded the march of history. Luis de Santander, finance minister to Ferdinand, reproached Isabella for lack of imagination and enterprise, tempted her with the prospect of converting Asia to Christianity, and proposed to finance the expedition himself with the aid of his friends. Several other Jews, Don Isaac Abravanel, Juan Cabrero, Abraham Señor, supported his plea. Isabella was moved, and offered to pledge her jewels to raise the needed sum. Santander judged this unnecessary. He borrowed 1,400,000 maravedis from the fraternity of which he was treasurer. He added 350,000 out of his own pocket, and Columbus somehow got together 250,000 more. On April 17, 1492, the king signed the requisite papers. Then or later he gave Columbus a letter to the Khan of Cathay. It was China, not India, that Columbus hoped to reach, and which to the end of his life he thought he had found. On August 3rd, the Santa Maria, his flagship, the Pinta, and the Niña sailed from Palos with 88 men and provisions for a year. 2. America. They headed south to the Canary Islands, seeking winds from the east before they faced into the west. After a long stay at the islands, they ventured forth, on September 6th, along the 28th parallel of latitude, not quite far enough south to get the full boon of the trade winds. We know now that a still more southerly crossing would have shortened the distance and tribulation to America. The weather was kindly, like April in Andalusia, Columbus noted in his log. The only thing wanting was to hear nightingales. 33 days passed anxiously. Columbus underestimated to his men the nautical mileage of each day, but as he overestimated his speed, his statements were unwillingly correct. The calms persisting, he changed his course, whereupon, even more than before, the crew felt lost in the aimless wastes of the sea. On October 9th, the captains of the Pinta and the Nina boarded the flagship and pleaded for an immediate turnabout back to Spain. Columbus promised that unless land were sighted in 3 days, he would do as they wished. On October 10th, his own crew mutinied, but he appeased them with the same pledge. On October 11th, they drew from the ocean a green branch bearing flowers. Their trust in the admiral returned. At 2 o'clock the next morning, under a nearly full moon, Rodrigo de Triana, the lookout on the Nina, shouted, "Tierra! Tierra!" It was land at last. When dawn came, they saw naked natives on the beach, all of good stature. The 3 captains were rowed to the shore by armed men. They knelt, kissed the ground, and thanked God. Columbus christened the island San Salvador, Holy Savior, and took possession of it in the name of Ferdinand, Isabella, and Christ. The savages received their future enslavers with civilized courtesies. The admiral wrote, "In order that we might win good friendship, because I knew that they were a people who could better be freed and converted to our Holy Father by love than by force, I gave to some of them red caps and to some glass beads, and many other things of slight value, in which they took much pleasure. They remained so much our friends that it was a marvel, and later they came swimming to the ship's boats and brought us parrots and cotton thread and many other things, and in exchange we gave them little glass beads. Finally, they exchanged with us everything they had with good will." The report of the friendly, flowing savage, which was to bewitch Rousseau, Chateaubriand, and Whitman, may have begun then and there. But among the first things that Columbus learned on the island was that these natives were subject to slave raids by other native groups, and that they themselves, or their ancestors, had conquered earlier indigenies. 2 days after landing, the admiral struck an ominous note in his journal. "These people are very unskilled in arms. With 50 men they could all be subjected and made to do all that one wished." But alas, there was no gold in San Salvador. On October 14th, the little fleet sailed again, seeking Cipango, Japan, and gold. On October 28th, the landing was made on Cuba. There, too, the natives were well disposed. They tried to join their visitors in singing the Ave Maria and did their best to make the sign of the cross. When Columbus showed them gold, they seemed to indicate that he would find some at a point in the interior which they called Cubanacam, that is, mid-Cuba. Mistaking this for El Gran Khan, the great Khan of China, he sent 2 Spaniards with full diplomatic credentials to find that elusive potentate. They returned without locating the Khan, but with a pleasant account of the courtesies with which they had been everywhere received. They brought also the first report by Europeans of American tobacco. They had seen male and female natives smoking tobacco herbs rolled into a cigar, which was inserted into the nose. Disappointed, Columbus left Cuba on December 4th, taking with him by force 5 native youths to serve as interpreters and 7 women to comfort them. All died en route to Spain. Meanwhile, Columbus's senior captain, Martin Alonso Pinzon, had deserted with his ship to hunt gold on his own. On December 5th, Columbus reached Haiti. There he remained 4 weeks, welcomed and feasted by the natives. He found some gold and felt himself a bit closer to the Khan, but his flagship grounded on a reef and was smashed to pieces by waves and rocks on the eve of the Christmas that he had planned to celebrate as the happiest of his life. Luckily, the Nina was nearby to rescue the crew, and the kindly natives ventured out in their canoes to help salvage most of the cargo before the vessel sank. The chieftain consoled Columbus with hospitality and gold and assurances that there was plenty of the murderous metal in Haiti. The admiral thanked God for the gold, forgave him for the shipwreck, and wrote in his journal that Ferdinand and Isabella would now have funds sufficient to conquer the Holy Land. He was so impressed with the good manners of the natives that he left part of his crew as a settlement to explore the island while he returned to Spain to report his discoveries. On January 6, 1493, Pinzon rejoined him with the Pinta. His apologies were accepted, for Columbus was loath to sail back with only one ship. On January 16th, they began the journey home. It was a long and miserable voyage. All through January the winds were hostile, and on February 12th a violent storm buffeted the tiny ships, which were not much more than 70 feet long. As they approached the Azores, Pinzon deserted again, hoping to be the first to reach Spain with the great news that Asia had been found. The Nina anchored off Santa Maria in the Azores on February 17th. Half the crew went ashore, partly to make a pilgrimage to a shrine of the Virgin. They were arrested by the Portuguese authorities and were kept in jail for 4 days while Columbus fretted offshore. They were released, and the Nina sailed again, but another storm drove it from its course, split its sails, and so depressed the sailors that they vowed to spend their first day on land fasting on bread and water and observing the 10 Commandments. On March 3rd they sighted Portugal, and though Columbus knew that he was risking a diplomatic mess, he decided to disembark at Lisbon rather than attempt the remaining 225 miles to Palos with one sail. John II received him with courtesy, the Nina was repaired, and on March 15th it reached Palos after infinite toil and terror, said Columbus, 193 days after leaving that port. Martin Pinzon had landed on northwestern Spain several days before, and had sent a message to Ferdinand and Isabella, but they refused to see him or his messenger. The Pinta sailed into Palos a day after the Nina. Pinzon fled in fear and disgrace to his home, took to his bed, and died. 3. The Waters of Bitterness. Columbus was welcomed by King and Queen at Barcelona, lived 6 months at the court, and received the title Almirante del Mar Oceano, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, by which was meant the Atlantic west of the Azores. He was made governor of the New World, or as he described himself, vice-king and general governor of the islands and terra firma of Asia and India. As John II was rumored to be fitting out a fleet to cross the Atlantic, Ferdinand appealed to Alexander VI to define the rights of Spain in the ocean sea. The Spanish Pope, in a series of bulls in 1493, allotted to Spain all non-Christian lands west, and to Portugal all those east, of an imaginary line drawn north and south 270 miles west of the Azores and the Cape Verde Islands. The Portuguese refused to accept this line of demarcation, and war was imminent when the rival governments, by the Treaty of Tordesillas on June 7, 1494, agreed that the line should run along a meridian of longitude 250 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands for discoveries before that date, but 370 leagues west for later discoveries. The eastern corner of Brazil lies east of this second line. The papal bulls termed the new terrain Indies. Scholars like Pietro Martire d'Anghiera accepted Columbus's notion that he had reached Asia. And this delusion persisted till Magellan circumnavigated the globe. Hoping for gold, Ferdinand and Isabella provided Columbus with a new fleet of 17 vessels, equipped with 1,200 seamen, animals to start flocks and herds in the Indies, and 5 ecclesiastics to shrive the Spaniards and convert the Indians. The second voyage sailed from Seville on September 25, 1493. 39 days later, as against 70 days for the first voyage, the watch sighted an island which Columbus, because the day was Sunday, named Dominica. No landing was made there. The admiral scented bigger prey. He passed through the westernmost group of the Lesser Antilles and was so impressed by their number that he named them 11,000 Virgenes, 11,000 virgins. They are still the Virgin Islands. Sailing on, he discovered Puerto Rico. He dallied there briefly, then hurried on to see what had happened to the Spanish settlement that he had left in Haiti 10 months before. Hardly a man remained of it. The Europeans had roamed the island, robbing the natives of gold and women. They had established a tropical paradise with 5 women to each man. They had quarreled and murdered one another, and nearly all the rest had been killed by the outraged Indians. The fleet sailed eastward along the Haitian coast. On January 2, 1494, the admiral landed men and cargo to found a new settlement, which he called Isabella. After supervising the construction of a town and the repair of his ships, he left to explore Cuba. Unable to circumnavigate it, he concluded that it was the mainland of Asia, perhaps the Malay Peninsula. He thought of rounding it and circling the globe, but his ships were not equipped for it. He turned back toward Haiti on October 29, 1494, wondering how his new settlement had fared. He was shocked to find that it had behaved like its predecessor, that the Spaniards had raped native women, stolen native stores of food, and kidnapped native boys to serve as slaves, and that the natives had killed many Spaniards in revenge. The missionaries had made little attempt to Christianize the Indians. One friar had joined a group of malcontents who had sailed back to Spain to give the sovereigns a discouraging report of Haiti's reputed resources. Columbus himself now became a slave dealer. He sent out expeditions to capture 1,500 natives. 400 of these he gave to the settlers, 500 he dispatched to Spain. 200 of these died on the voyage. The survivors were sold at Seville, but died in a few years, unable to adjust themselves to the colder climate, or perhaps to the savagery of civilization. Leaving orders with his brother Bartolomé to transfer the settlement from Isabella to a better site at Santo Domingo, now Ciudad Trujillo, Columbus sailed for Spain on March 10, 1496, and reached Cadiz after an unhappy voyage of 93 days. He presented his sovereigns with Indians and gold nuggets. It was not much, but it modified the doubts that had formed at court about the wisdom of pouring more money into the Atlantic. The admiral was uncomfortable on land. The salt of the sea was in his blood. He begged for at least 8 ships for another trial of fortune. The sovereigns consented, and in May 1498, Columbus sailed again. This third voyage moved southwest to the 10th meridian of latitude, then followed this due west. On July 31st, the crew sighted the great island which the pious commander named Trinidad. And on August 31st, he saw the mainland of South America, perhaps a year before, perhaps a year after Vespucci. After exploring the Gulf of Paria, he sailed northwest and reached Santo Domingo August 31st. This third settlement had survived, but one of every 4 of the 500 Spaniards that he had left there in 1496 was suffering from syphilis, and the settlers had divided into 2 hostile groups that were now on the verge of war. To appease the discontent, Columbus allowed each man to appropriate a large tract of land, and to enslave the natives dwelling on it. This became the rule in the Spanish settlements. Worn now with hardships, disappointments, arthritis, and a disease of the eyes, Columbus almost broke down under these problems. His mind clouded occasionally. He became irritable, querulous, dictatorial, avaricious, and ruthless in his punishments. So at least many of the Spaniards claimed, and they fretted under an Italian's rule. He recognized that the problems of managing the settlement were alien to his training and temperament. In October 1499, he sent 2 caravels to Spain with a request that Ferdinand and Isabella should appoint a royal commissioner to help him govern the island. The sovereigns took him at his word and appointed Francisco de Bobadilla, but going beyond the admiral's request, they gave their commissioner full authority, even over Columbus. Bobadilla reached Santo Domingo while Columbus was away, and heard many complaints of the manner in which Cristoforo and his brothers Bartolomé and Diego had ruled what was now called Hispaniola. When Columbus returned, Bobadilla had him cast into jail with manacles on his arms and fetters on his feet. After a further inquest, the commissioner sent the 3 brothers, in chains, to Spain on October 1st, 1500. Arriving at Cadiz, Columbus wrote a pitiful letter to friends at court. "It is now 17 years since I came to serve these princes with the enterprise of the Indies. They made me pass 8 of them in discussion, and at the end rejected it as a thing of jest. Nonetheless, I persisted therein. Over there I have placed under their sovereignty more land than there is in Africa and Europe, and more than 1,700 islands. In 7 years I, by the divine will, made that conquest. At a time when I was entitled to expect rewards and retirement, I was incontinently arrested and sent home loaded with chains. The accusation was brought out of malice on the basis of charges made by civilians who had revolted and wished to take possession of the land. I beg your graces, with the zeal of faithful Christians in whom their highnesses have confidence, to read all my papers and to consider how I, who came from so far to serve these princes, now at the end of my days have been despoiled of my honor and my property without cause, wherein is neither justice nor mercy." Ferdinand was busy dividing the kingdom of Naples with Louis XII. 6 weeks went by before he ordered Columbus and his brothers released and summoned them to court. King and Queen received them in the Alhambra, consoled them, and restored them to affluence, but not to their former authority in the New World. By the capitulations or agreement that they had signed in 1492, the sovereigns were bound to leave Columbus full authority in the lands he had discovered, but they felt that he was no longer fit to exercise it. They named Don Nicolas de Ovando as new governor of the Indies, However, they allowed the admiral to collect all his property rights at Santo Domingo, and all that was hitherto due him of the gold diggings and trade. Columbus lived the rest of his life a rich man. But he was not content. He importuned the king and queen for one more fleet, and though they were not yet clear that the enterprise of the Indies would bring them a net gain, they felt that they owed him another trial. On May 9, 1502, from Cadiz, Columbus began his fourth voyage, with 4 ships and 140 men, including his brother Bartolome and his son Fernando. On June 15th, he sighted Martinique. On June 29th, feeling a storm in the air and in his joints, he anchored off a sheltered spot of the Haitian shore near Santo Domingo. A fleet of 30 ships was in the main harbor, about to sail for Spain. Columbus sent word to the governor that a hurricane was brewing, and advised him to detain the vessels for a while. Ovando rejected the warning and dispatched the fleet. The hurricane arrived. The admiral's ship survived it with minor damage. Of the governor's fleet, all vessels but one were wrecked. 500 lives were lost, including Bobadilla's, and a rich cargo of gold was surrendered to the sea. Columbus now began, unsuspectingly, the most arduous and tragic months in his troubled career. Continuing westward, he reached Honduras and explored the coast of Nicaragua and Costa Rica in the hope of finding a strait that would let him circumnavigate the earth. On December 5th, 1502, a tempest of wind and rain arose, whose mad force is vividly described in Columbus's journal. For 9 days I was as one lost, without any hope of life. Eyes never beheld the sea so high, angry, and covered with foam. The wind not only prevented our progress, but offered no opportunity to run behind any headland for shelter. Hence we were forced to keep out in this bloody ocean, seething like a pot on a hot fire. Never did the sky look more terrible. For 1 whole day and night it blazed like a furnace, and the lightning broke forth with such violence that each time I wondered if it had carried off my spars and sails. The flashes came with such fury and frightfulness that we all thought the ships would be blasted. All this time the water never ceased to fall from the sky. I do not say it rained, for it was like another deluge. The men were so worn out that they longed for death to end their dreadful suffering. To add to the terror of wind, water, lightning, and rocky reefs nearby, a waterspout, a spray-spreading twister in the sea, appeared, perilously close to the ships and shooting water up to the clouds. Columbus took out his Bible and read from it how Christ had stilled the storm at Capernaum. Then he exorcised the waterspout by tracing with his sword a cross in the sky, whereupon, we are told, the tower of water collapsed. After 12 awful days the fury passed, and the fleet rested in a harbor near the present eastern end of the Panama Canal. There Columbus and his men celebrated sadly the Christmas of 1502 and the New Year's Day of 1503, not knowing that the Pacific was only 40 miles away. Further misfortunes came. 13 sailors, rowing the flagship's boat up a river to find fresh water, were attacked by Indians. All but one of the Spaniards were killed, and the boat was lost. 2 vessels had to be abandoned as too worm-eaten to be seaworthy. The other 2 leaked so badly that the pumps had to be worked night and day. Finally, the worms proved stronger than the men, and these surviving ships had to be beached on a shore of Jamaica on June 25, 1503. There the hapless crew remained a year and 5 days, depending for food on the precarious friendship of the natives, who themselves had little to spare. Diego Mendez, whose calm courage in all this adversity kept Columbus from complete despair, volunteered to lead 6 Christians and 10 Indians in a dugout canoe 455 miles, 80 of them out of sight of land, to Santo Domingo to solicit aid. On that venture their water ran out, and several Indians died. Mendez reached his goal, but Ovando would not, or could not, spare a vessel till May 1504 to go to the admiral's relief. By February, the Jamaica Indians had reduced their gifts of food to the stranded crew to the point where the Spaniards began to starve. Columbus had with him Regiomontanus's Ephemerides, which calculated a lunar eclipse for February 29th. He called in the native chiefs and warned them that God, in his anger at their letting his men starve, was about to blot out the moon. They scoffed, but when the eclipse began, they hurriedly brought food to the ships. Columbus reassured them, saying that he had prayed to God to restore the moon, and had promised him that the Indians would properly feed the Christians thereafter. The moon reappeared. 4 more months passed before help came. Even then, the ship that Ovando sent leaked so badly that it was barely able to return to Santo Domingo. Columbus, with his brother and son, sailed in a stouter vessel to Spain, arriving November 7th after a long and stormy voyage. The king and queen were disappointed that he had not found more gold, or a strait to the Indian Ocean, and neither Ferdinand nor Isabella, who was dying, had time to receive the white-haired sailor finally home from the sea. His tenths from Haiti were still paid to him. He suffered from arthritis, but not from poverty. When at last Ferdinand consented to see him, Columbus, older than his 58 years, could hardly bear the long journey to the court at Segovia. He demanded all the titles, rights, and revenues promised him in 1492. The king demurred and offered him a rich estate in Castile. Columbus refused. He followed the court to Salamanca and Valladolid, and there, broken in body and heart, he died, May 20th, 1506. No man had ever so remade the map of the earth. 4. The New Perspective. Now that he had shown the way, 100 other mariners rushed to the New World. That name was apparently first used by a Florentine merchant whose own name now describes the Americas. Amerigo Vespucci was sent to Spain by the Medici to straighten out the affairs of a Florentine banker. In 1495 he won a contract to fit out 12 vessels for Ferdinand. He caught the exploration fever, and in letters later written to friends in Florence he claimed that he had made 4 voyages to what he termed Novo Mondo, and that on one of these, on June 16, 1497, he had touched the mainland of South America. As John Cabot reached Cape Breton Island in the Gulf of St. Lawrence on June 24, 1497, and Columbus sighted Venezuela in 1498, Vespucci's account could give him the credit of being the first European to reach the mainland of the Western Hemisphere since Leif Erikson, circa 1000. Confusion and inaccuracies in Vespucci's reports have cast doubt on his claims, but it is noteworthy that in 1505, Columbus, who by that time should have been able to judge Vespucci's reliability, entrusted him with a letter to the Admiral San Diego. In 1508, Vespucci was made Piloto Mayor, chief of all the pilots of Spain, and held that position till his death. A Latin version of one of his letters was printed at Saint-Dié in Lorraine in April 1507. Martin Waldseemüller, professor of cosmography in the University of Saint-Dié, quoted the letter in his Cosmographiae Introductio, which he published there in that year. He accepted Vespucci's account as trustworthy and suggested that the name Amerige, or America, should be given to what we now term South America. In 1538, Gerhardus Mercator applied America, on one of his famous maps, to all the Western Hemisphere. It is agreed that in 1499, if not in 1497, Vespucci, sailing with Alonso de Ojeda, explored the coast of Venezuela. In 1500, shortly after Cabral's accidental discovery of Brazil, Vicente Pinzon, who had commanded the Nina on Columbus's first voyage, explored the Brazilian coast and discovered the Amazon. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa sighted the Pacific, and Ponce de Leon, dreaming of a fountain of youth, discovered Florida. The discoveries begun by Henry the Navigator, advanced by Vasco da Gama, culminating in Columbus, and rounded out by Magellan, effected the greatest commercial revolution in history before the coming of the airplane. The opening of the western and southern seas to navigation and trade ended the Mediterranean epoch in the history of civilization and began the Atlantic era. As more and more of America's gold came to Spain, economic decline progressed in the Mediterranean states, and even in those South German cities which, like Augsburg and Nuremberg, had been commercially tied with Italy. The Atlantic nations found in the New World an outlet for their surplus population, their reserve energy, and their criminals, and developed there avid markets for European goods. Industry was stimulated in Western Europe and demanded the mechanical inventions and better forms of power that made the Industrial Revolution. New plants came from America to enrich European agriculture: the potato, tomato, artichoke, squash, maize. The influx of gold and silver raised prices, encouraged manufacturers, harassed workers, creditors, and feudal lords, and generated and ruined Spain's dream of dominating the world. The moral and mental effects of the explorations rivaled the economic and political results. Christianity was spread over a vast hemisphere, so that the Roman Catholic Church gained more adherents in the New World than the Reformation took from her in the Old. The Spanish and Portuguese languages were given to Latin America, and produced there vigorous independent literatures. European morals were not improved by the discoveries. The lawless brutality of the colonists flowed back to Europe with returning seamen and settlers and brought an intensification of violence and sexual irregularity. The European intellect was powerfully moved by the revelation of so many peoples, customs, and cults. The dogmas of the great religions suffered by mutual attrition. And even while Protestants and Catholics raised their hostile certainties to ruinous wars, these certitudes were melting away into the doubts and consequent tolerance of the Enlightenment. Above all, a pride of achievement inspired the human mind just when Copernicus was about to reduce the cosmic importance of the earth and its inhabitants. Men felt that the world of matter had been conquered by the courage of the human mind. The medieval motto for Gibraltar, ne plus ultra, was denied by abbreviation. It became now plus ultra, more beyond. All limits were removed. All the world was open. Everything seemed possible. Now, with a bold and optimistic surge, modern history began. Chapter 14. Erasmus the Forerunner, 1469 to 1517. 1. The Education of a Humanist. The greatest of the humanists, born in or near Rotterdam in 1466 or 1469, the second and natural son of Gerard, a clerk in minor orders, and of Margaret, the widowed daughter of a physician. Apparently the father became a priest shortly after this contretemps. We do not know how the boy came by the fond name of Desiderius Erasmus, meaning the desired beloved. His first teachers taught him to read and write Dutch, but when he went to study with the brethren of the common life at Deventer, he was fined for speaking his native tongue. There Latin was the pièce de résistance, and piety was as rigorous as discipline. Nevertheless, the brethren encouraged the study of selected pagan classics, and Erasmus began at Deventer to acquire his astonishing command of the Latin language and literature. About 1484, both his parents died. The father left a modest estate to his two sons, but their guardians absorbed most of it and steered the youths into a monastic career as one requiring no patrimony at all. They protested, wishing to go to a university. Finally, they were persuaded. Erasmus, we are told, by the promise of access to many books. The older son accepted his fate and rose to be, Erasmus reported, strenuus compotor nex squartator ignavus, a mighty toper and no mean fornicator. Desiderius took vows as an Augustinian canon in the priory of Emmaus at Stein. He tried hard to like monastic life, even wrote an essay, De Contemptu Mundi, to convince himself that a monastery was just the place for a lad of avid spirit and queasy stomach. But his stomach complained of fasts and turned at the smell of fish. The vow of obedience proved yet more irksome than that of chastity, and perhaps the monastic library ran short on classics. The kindly prior took pity on him and lent him as secretary to Henry of Bergen, Bishop of Cambrai. Erasmus now, in 1492, accepted ordination as a priest. But wherever he was, he had one foot elsewhere. He envied the young men who had gone on from their local schooling to universities. Paris exuded an aroma of learning and lust that could intoxicate keen senses across great distances. After some years of able service, Desiderius induced the bishop to send him to the University of Paris, armed with just enough money to survive. He listened impatiently to lectures, but consumed the libraries. He attended plays and parties, and occasionally explored feminine charms. He remarks in one of his colloquies that the most pleasant way of learning French was from the filles de joie. Nevertheless, his strongest passion was for literature, the musical magic of words opening the door to a world of imagination and delight. He taught himself Greek. In time, the Athens of Plato and Euripides, Zeno and Epicurus became as familiar to him as the Rome of Cicero, Horace, and Seneca, and both cities were almost as real to him as the left bank of the Seine. Seneca seemed to him as good a Christian as St. Paul, and a much better stylist, a point on which perhaps his taste was not quite sound. Wandering at will through the centuries, he discovered Lorenzo Valla, the Neapolitan Voltaire. He relished the elegant Latin and reckless audacity with which Valla had flayed the forgery of the donation of Constantine, had noted serious errors in the Vulgate, and had debated whether Epicureanism might not be the wisest modus vivendi. Erasmus himself would later startle theologians and comfort some cardinals by seeking to reconcile Epicurus and Christ. Echoes of Duns Scotus and Occam still resounded in Paris. Nominalism was in the ascendant, and threatened such basic doctrines as transubstantiation and the Trinity. These escapades of thought damaged the young priest's orthodoxy, leaving him not much more than a profound admiration for the ethics of Christ. His addiction to books was almost as expensive as a vice. To add to his allowance, he gave private instructions to younger students and went to live with one of them. Even so, he had not enough to be comfortable. He importuned the Bishop of Cambrai. "My skin and my purse both need filling, the one with flesh, the other with coins. Act with your usual kindness," to which the bishop responded with his usual moderation. One pupil, the Lord of Vere, invited him to his castle at Tournam in Flanders. Erasmus was charmed to find in Lady Anne of Vere a patroness of genius. She recognized this condition in him and helped him with a gift which was soon consumed. Another rich pupil, Mountjoy, took him to England in 1499. There, in the great country houses of the aristocracy, the harassed scholar found a realm of refined pleasure that turned his monastic past into a shuddering memory. He reported his progress to a friend in Paris in one of those innumerable, inimitable letters that are now his most living monument. "We are getting on. If you are wise, you too will fly over here. If you only knew the blessings of Britain. To take one attraction out of many, there are nymphs here with divine features, so gentle and kind. Moreover, there is a fashion that cannot be commended enough. Wherever you go, you are received on all hands with kisses. When you leave, you are dismissed with kisses. If you go back, your salutes are returned to you. Wherever a meeting takes place, there are salutes in abundance. Wherever you turn, you are never without them. Oh, Faustus, if you had once tasted how soft and fragrant those lips are, you would wish to be a traveler, not for 10 years like Solon, but for your whole life in England." At Mountjoy's house in Greenwich, Erasmus met Thomas More, then only 22, yet distinguished enough to secure the scholar an introduction to the future Henry VIII. At Oxford he was almost as charmed by the informal companionship of students and faculty as he had been by the embraces of country-house divinities. There he learned to love John Colet, who, though assertor and champion of the old theology, astonished his time by practicing Christianity. Erasmus was impressed by the progress of humanism in England. "When I hear my Colet, I seem to be listening to Plato himself. Engrossing, who does not marvel at such a perfect world of learning? What can be more acute, profound, and delicate than the judgment of Linacre? What has nature ever created more gentle, sweet, and happy than the genius of Thomas More?" These men influenced Erasmus profoundly for his betterment. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.